I didn't even look up when she said, "You have 24 hours to leave." The metal clang hit my front door first, sharp and hollow, echoing down the quiet street like someone dropping a wrench onto concrete. And then came the murmur. Neighbors' doors opening, footsteps on driveways, the low hum of curiosity spreading faster than the morning heat already rising off the asphalt. And I could smell it too. That faint burnt coffee scent drifting from somewhere nearby, mixing with fresh-cut grass and something else, something tense, like anticipation. I opened the door slowly, not because I was surprised, but because I already knew exactly what I'd find. And there it was, bolted crookedly into the wood. A bright white notice stamped in bold red letters. Removal order. Like I was some kind of problem they could just peel off the neighborhood. Linda Crawford stood 3 steps back, arms crossed, chin slightly lifted, sunglasses hiding her eyes but not the smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. And behind her, like an audience she'd carefully arranged, stood half the block. Mr. Jensen still in his robe, the couple from 2 houses down whispering to each other. Someone holding a coffee mug midair like they didn't want to miss the show. "Let this be an example," Linda said, loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice slicing clean through the morning air, and I could feel every pair of eyes shift from her to me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to crack, to argue, to prove whatever story she'd already told them about who I was. I didn't give them that. I just reached out, touched the edge of the notice, felt the cheap plastic flex under my fingers, and let the silence stretch a second longer than she expected. "You're in violation of multiple HOA standards," she continued, flipping open a folder like she was reading charges in a courtroom. "Unauthorized vehicle, improper lawn maintenance, and failure to comply with community aesthetics." And there it was, that word, community, as if she owned the definition of it. I glanced past her at the rows of identical houses, the perfectly trimmed hedges, the driveways with cars that probably cost more than my entire setup, and I knew exactly what they saw when they looked at me. The old pickup parked slightly off-center, the worn work boots by the step, the fact that I didn't wave or chat or try to fit into their version of normal. "People like you don't last here," Linda added, softer now, but somehow sharper, like she wanted that line to land deeper than the rest, and a couple of heads nodded behind her, subtle but noticeable. I leaned against the doorframe, letting the wood press into my shoulder, and for a second, I just listened, to the distant hum of a lawn mower starting up, to the faint buzz of insects already awake, to the quiet confidence in her voice that told me she believed every word she was saying. "You've been notified multiple times," she went on, tapping the folder. "And since you've failed to correct the issues, the board has decided to proceed with removal." And she paused there, just long enough to let the weight of that word sink in, like she was handing down something final. Removal. Like I didn't belong on land I'd paid for, like a piece on a board she could just slide off when it didn't match her design. I looked at her again, really looked this time, at the way she stood so firmly in place, like she'd done this before, like she'd won before, and maybe she had. Maybe this neighborhood had always bent to her voice, to her rules, to her version of order. I could feel the eyes on me tighten, waiting for the moment I'd push back, and when I didn't, I saw the smallest flicker of confusion cross her face. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked, and there was something in her tone now. Impatience, maybe, or the beginning of irritation that I wasn't playing my part. I nodded once, slow and deliberate, then reached up and pulled the notice off the door, the screws resisting just enough to make a faint scraping sound, and held it in my hand like it weighed nothing. "Yeah," I said quietly, glancing down at the bold red letters, then back up at her. "I understand." The street went still for a second, like everything was waiting for what came next, and I could almost feel the shift starting, subtle but real, like a crack forming beneath something that had always seemed solid. I folded the notice once, clean and precise, and stepped back inside without another word, closing the door gently behind me as the murmurs outside started to rise. Again, louder this time, less certain, and I let out a slow breath, already reaching for my phone because this wasn't the end of anything, not even close. They had no idea what they'd just started. I stood in my kitchen with the folded notice still in my hand, the paper already softening at the crease where I had pressed it too tightly. And for a moment, I just let the silence settle in, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of someone's garage door opening down the street. Like life outside was continuing exactly the way Linda expected it to, as if nothing had shifted at all. But I knew better, because I had seen that flicker in her expression when I did not react the way she wanted, and that was always the first sign that something underneath the surface was starting to move. I set the notice down on the counter next to my keys, right beside a stack of unopened envelopes that looked almost identical. Same logo, same tone, same attempt at control disguised as order, and I could not help but let my eyes drift over them one by one, remembering each time they had arrived like clockwork, every Monday morning, always early, always deliberate, like someone was making sure I never forgot that I was being watched. The first one had been about my truck, parked half a foot too far from the curb. Then it was the grass, measured down to the inch. Then the color of a storage bin barely visible behind my fence. And each time I had read them, folded them, and set them aside, not because I did not understand the rules, but because I understood something else better, how people like Linda operated when they thought they were in complete control. I picked up my phone, the screen lighting up instantly, and scrolled through a list of contacts until I paused on one name, my thumb hovering just long enough to feel that familiar sense of timing settle in. Because there is always a right moment to move, and then there is a moment when you let the other side believe they have already won, and those two moments are never the same. Outside, I could hear voices again, softer now, but still there, drifting through the thin gap at the edge of the window. Fragments of conversation that carried just enough to tell me that I had already become a topic, something to discuss over coffee and morning routines, and I could picture it clearly without even looking. Linda is standing there a little longer than necessary, explaining what had just happened, shaping the story before anyone else had the chance to question it. I unlocked the phone and opened a file instead of making the call, a simple document at first glance, nothing flashy, just rows of addresses, dates, and names, but I knew every line of it, knew how each property connected, how each signature had been placed exactly where it needed to be, and how long it had taken to build something that did not look like power from the outside, but carried more weight than most people would ever recognize. My reflection caught in the dark edge of the screen for a second, and I almost smiled, not out of amusement, but because I had seen this pattern before, different faces, different neighborhoods, same certainty from people who believed authority came from a title printed on a piece of paper. I set the phone down and walked over to the window, just enough to glance through the blinds without making it obvious, and sure enough, Linda was still there, now speaking to Mr. Jensen, her posture relaxed again, confidence restored, like the moment of hesitation had already been erased from her memory, and he nodded along, slow and agreeable, the way people do when they want to stay on the right side of whoever holds the clipboard. I could see a couple more neighbors lingering, pretending to check their mail or adjust something in their yard, but really just staying close enough to keep listening. And it struck me how quickly a situation turns into a narrative when someone like Linda is the one telling it. I turned away from the window and picked up one of the earlier notices, flipping it over to the back where the fine print sat in dense, legal language, the kind most people skim or ignore entirely. But I read every word, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to remember exactly how far they had already stepped beyond what they were allowed to do. The word removal echoed in my head again, not as a threat, but as a miscalculation, a line crossed. Too early, too confidently. And I knew that once something like that is put in writing, it does not just disappear when things start to unravel. I reached for my phone again, this time without hesitation, and tapped the contact I had been thinking about since the moment the metal hit my door, lifting it to my ear as it began to ring, each tone steady and even, matching the calm that had already settled in, because this was no longer about reacting, it was about timing, and I had just decided it was time to move. The call connected, and before the other person could say more than a greeting, I spoke, my voice low and clear, giving only what was necessary and nothing more. Then I ended the call just as quickly, placing the phone back on the counter beside the folded notice, both of them sitting there like two pieces of the same story that had not fully come together yet. Outside, a car engine started, and footsteps faded, the morning slowly returning to its routine rhythm, but something about it felt different now, like the calm before a shift no one else could see yet. And as I looked down at the notice one more time, I realized Linda had just made the one move she could not take back. By the time the sun climbed high enough to bleach the color out of the street, the second wave hit, quieter but more deliberate, like someone tightening a grip instead of making a show, and I heard it before I saw it. The soft click of a car door, the crunch of gravel, then a firm knock that did not wait for an answer, and when I opened the door this time, there was no audience. Just a man in a pressed polo with a clipboard held close to his chest, the HOA logo printed neatly at the top, and behind him, parked along the curb, Linda's car sat angled just enough to let me know she was still watching without needing to step out again. "Mr. Cole," he said, checking his paper like he needed confirmation, even though he already knew exactly who I was. "I am here to document compliance status following your removal notice." And his tone was careful, professional, the kind of voice people use when they want to sound neutral while carrying out someone else's decision. I stepped aside just enough to lean against the frame again, keeping my posture relaxed, letting him take in whatever details he thought he needed, and I noticed the way his eyes moved quickly, scanning the porch, the corners, the edges of things that most people would not even register, like he had been given a checklist and told not to miss anything. "You have until tomorrow at this time," he added, tapping the paper lightly. "After that, further action may be taken." And there it was again, that phrase, vague enough to sound official, specific enough to feel like a threat if you did not know better. I nodded once, the same way I had before, and he hesitated for a second, like he expected more, maybe an argument, maybe a question, something that would justify the effort they were putting into this, but I gave him nothing, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. "Do you have any statements regarding the violations?" he asked, almost as if he was required to, and I glanced past him, toward the street, where a couple of curtains shifted slightly in nearby windows, subtle but not invisible, the quiet kind of attention people think no one notices. "No," I said simply, and the word hung there, flat and final, and for a moment, neither of us moved. He cleared his throat, scribbled something on the clipboard, then gave a short nod before turning back toward his car, his steps quicker now, like he was done playing his part in whatever this was supposed to be. I closed the door again, slower this time, letting the latch settle into place with a soft click, and walked back into the kitchen where the notice still sat exactly where I had left it, the edges slightly curled now from the humidity, the bold red letters no less certain of themselves than they had been an hour ago. I picked it up again, not to read it, but to fold it once more, tighter this time, aligning the edges carefully, the way you do when you want something to stay exactly as it is until you decide otherwise, and I set it down next to my phone, where a new message had appeared on the screen, just a single line confirming what I had expected: "Documents received, review in progress." I tapped it open, scanning the timestamp, the attached file, the initials at the bottom, all the small details that mattered more than anything written on that notice outside, and I felt that same steady calm settle in deeper, not because anything had changed yet, but because I knew exactly how it would. I walked over to the small desk in the corner, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thin folder, plain on the outside, unmarked, but inside it held copies of things most people in this neighborhood had never seen, documents tied to addresses they drove past every day without a second thought, agreements signed years before I ever set foot on this street, and I flipped through them slowly, stopping on a page that listed a familiar name, then another, and another, each one connected in a way that did not look obvious until you knew where to look. Outside, a car passed by, the sound fading quickly, and somewhere down the block, a dog barked once, sharp and brief, like a warning that did not quite know what it was warning about. I closed the folder and set it on the desk, leaving it open just enough to see the corner of that page, the name still visible if you stood in the right spot, and I leaned back slightly, letting my eyes drift toward the window again, where the street had returned to its quiet routine. No sign of Linda now, no sign of the man with the clipboard, just the same houses, the same driveways, the same illusion of order that had been there before any of this started. But something had already shifted, even if no one else could feel it yet, and as I looked at the phone, at the notice, at the folder, I knew the next move would not be theirs. The afternoon settled in slowly, the kind of heat that made everything feel a little heavier, a little quieter, and I stepped out onto the porch with a glass of water in my hand, letting the warmth hit my face as if nothing had changed, as if I was just another resident enjoying a normal day. And that was exactly the point. because the less I reacted, the more it forced everything else to come to me. Across the street, I noticed Mrs. Langley trimming her hedges. With short, precise movements, but every few seconds her eyes flicked in my direction, quick and subtle, like she did not want to be caught staring, and further down, a teenager pretended to scroll on his phone while sitting on a curb, his attention clearly somewhere else. And it did not take much to realize that the story Linda had started this morning was still moving, just without her needing to be physically present anymore. I took a slow sip of water and leaned against the railing, feeling the rough wood under my fingers, and let my eyes drift across the row of houses again, each one neat, controlled, identical in the way that made people feel safe, and I could almost hear Linda's voice in the background of it all, explaining how things were supposed to be, how order was maintained, how people like me disrupted that balance. And the thought alone was enough to make the corner of my mouth lift slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition of how predictable all of it was. A car rolled by at a steady pace, slower than necessary, and I caught a glimpse of the driver glancing toward me before quickly looking away. And then, almost on cue, my phone buzzed lightly in my hand, the vibration sharp against my palm, pulling my attention back to the present. I looked down at the screen and saw a new message, not from anyone in this neighborhood, not from anyone who cared about appearances or lawns or the color of storage bins, but from someone who dealt in things that did not need to be seen to matter, and the timing of it was exact, like everything else had been. I opened it and read the short line, then the attachment beneath it, and for a second, the noise of the street faded completely, replaced by the quiet clarity that comes when pieces start to align exactly the way you knew they would. I stepped back inside, closing the door behind me just enough to cut off the outside world, and walked straight to the desk, where the folder still lay open, the corner of that page waiting exactly where I had left it. I set the phone down beside it, and pulled the folder closer, flipping through the pages again, slower this time, matching each name on the paper to the addresses I had already memorized, each one tied to a structure that looked simple from the outside, but was anything but. The message on my phone confirmed what I needed, but seeing it laid out in front of me made it real in a different way, more concrete, more immediate, like a map you have studied suddenly becoming the ground beneath your feet. I paused on one page longer than the others, tracing a line of text with my finger, the name standing out not because it was unfamiliar, but because of how often I had heard it spoken since I arrived here, always with the same tone of authority, the same assumption of control, and I let out a quiet breath, not out of tension, but out of something closer to certainty. Outside, I could hear footsteps again, closer this time, then the faint creak of someone stepping onto my driveway, and I did not need to look to know who it was, because there was only one person in this neighborhood who moved like that, confident enough to approach without hesitation, convinced that every step she took was backed by something unshakable. The knock came a second later, sharper than before, more deliberate, and I closed the folder halfway, leaving just enough visible to remind myself of what was already in motion, then picked up my phone and turned the screen face down, letting the room settle into a stillness that felt almost deliberate. The knock came again, a little louder this time, followed by her voice, clear and controlled, carrying through the door like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. "Mr. Cole," Linda called out, "we need to talk about your next steps." And there was no trace of doubt in it, no hesitation, just the same certainty she had shown this morning, the same belief that everything was still exactly the way she expected it to be. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch just long enough, then reached for the handle and opened the door slowly, meeting her gaze without saying a word, and for the briefest second, something in her expression shifted again, too quick for most people to notice, but not for me, because I had been waiting for it. She stepped forward slightly, holding another document in her hand, thicker than the last, more official in its appearance, and as she extended it toward me, I realized she was about to push this further than she ever had before. She held the document out like it carried weight all on its own, thicker paper, embossed seal, the kind of thing designed to make people hesitate before they even read it, and I could see the confidence back in her posture, shoulders squared, chin lifted just enough to signal that whatever this was, she believed it would land harder than the last one. I took it from her without rushing, letting my fingers brush the edge of the page, feeling that same cheap stiffness dressed up to look official, and I noticed how she watched me closely this time. Not the way someone watches a neighbor, but the way someone watches for a reaction they expect to control. "This is your final compliance directive," she said, her voice steady, measured, like she had rehearsed it. "Failure to vacate within the specified period will result in enforced action under the authority of the association." And there it was again, that word authority, used like a shield, like something that did not need to be questioned. I glanced down at the paper, scanning the lines quickly, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to see how far they had gone, how much they had committed to writing, and every sentence confirmed the same thing, that they were moving forward without checking what stood underneath. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she added, softer now, almost conversational, like she was offering me a way out that only existed in her version of events, and I could hear the faint rustle of movement behind her again, subtle but present, neighbors lingering just out of sight, close enough to listen but far enough to pretend they were not involved. I looked back up at her, meeting her gaze directly this time, and for a second, neither of us spoke, the air between us still but charged with something neither of the onlookers could quite understand. "You really think this is going to hold?" I asked quietly, not challenging, not confrontational, just a simple question placed exactly where it needed to be, and I saw it again, that flicker, smaller this time, but there, like a crack she was trying to ignore. "It already does," she replied quickly, too quickly, her tone tightening just a fraction, and she shifted her weight slightly, adjusting the folder in her hand like it grounded her. I nodded once, letting that answer settle, then folded the new document the same way I had folded the first, precise, controlled, and held it for a moment before setting it down on the small table just inside the doorway, stacking it neatly on top of the other notice. "You should start preparing," she continued, her voice returning to its earlier firmness, "because once the board moves forward, there is no reversal." And that was the part she believed the most. I could tell, not just something she was saying, but something she had relied on before, something that had worked enough times to become truth in her mind. I leaned lightly against the doorframe again, letting the wood support my weight, and for a moment, I just looked at her, at the way she stood there so certain, so sure that the system she represented was solid, untouchable, and I wondered how many times she had stood in this exact spot, saying these exact words to someone else who did not push back, someone who accepted the version of reality she presented because it sounded official enough to be real. "Tomorrow," she said finally, stepping back half a pace, "we will be checking again," and there was a finality in that word, like she was closing a door that she believed I could not reopen. I nodded again, the same calm response, the same lack of resistance, and this time, I let a faint pause linger before speaking. "I will be here," I said, simple, direct, nothing more, and for a second, the quiet stretched between us in a way that felt different than before, like something had shifted just enough to be noticed, but not yet understood. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned, her steps measured as she walked back toward her car, the document folder tucked securely under her arm, her posture steady, unshaken on the surface, and as she reached the curb, she glanced once more over her shoulder, quick, almost instinctive, like she was checking something she could not quite name. I closed the door slowly, the latch clicking into place with a soft, final sound, and stood there for a second, listening to the fading noise of her car engine as it pulled away, the street gradually returning to its usual rhythm again, as if nothing had changed. I turned back toward the table, where the two folded notices now sat perfectly aligned, and reached for my phone, the screen lighting up instantly as I unlocked it, bringing up the same thread from earlier, the same confirmation, but now with a new update. A short message that carried far more weight than either of the documents Linda had handed me all day. I read it once, then again, slower this time, letting each word settle into place, and a quiet breath left my chest, not out of relief, but out of recognition that the moment I had been waiting for was no longer approaching. It had arrived. I picked up the folder from the desk, slid the new document inside alongside the others, and closed it carefully, the edges aligning cleanly, as if everything had already been decided long before this morning ever started. Outside, the light began to shift, the sun lowering just enough to cast longer shadows across the driveways, stretching everything slightly out of proportion, and I stepped toward the window again, looking out at the same row of houses, the same quiet street, the same carefully maintained order that had not yet realized it was standing on something it did not control, and I knew exactly where I needed to be next. By early evening, the light shifted into that soft gold that makes everything look calmer than it really is, stretching shadows across the street and turning the windows into mirrors, and I pulled into the parking lot 10 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start, engine idling for a second longer than necessary, as I watched people gathering near the entrance, small groups forming and breaking apart, voices low but animated, like something important was about to happen even if they did not fully understand what. The HOA building sat at the edge of the neighborhood, clean lines, neutral colors, a place designed to feel official without being intimidating. And as I stepped out of the truck, I could already feel the subtle shift in attention, a few heads turning, conversations pausing just long enough to register that I had arrived, then resuming with a slightly different tone. I closed the door gently, the sound solid and deliberate, and started toward the entrance, my steps unhurried, each one steady against the pavement. And as I got closer, I caught fragments of conversation drifting through the warm air, mentions of violation, removal, board decision, words repeated enough times to sound like facts even when they were not. Inside, the air felt cooler, conditioned, carrying that faint scent of polished surfaces and paper, and the room was already half full, chairs arranged in neat rows facing a long table at the front where the board would sit, microphones set up, documents stacked in careful piles, everything prepared to give the appearance of structure and control. I took a seat near the back, not hiding, just observing, letting the room fill in around me, and one by one, familiar faces filtered in, neighbors taking their places, some avoiding eye contact, others glancing quickly in my direction before looking away, and then, a few minutes later, Linda entered. She moved with the same confidence she had shown all day, shoulders back, steps measured, acknowledging a few people with small nods as she made her way to the front table, setting her folder down with a quiet but deliberate motion, like placing something exactly where it belonged. When she finally looked up, her eyes swept the room once, briefly, and when they reached me, there was that flicker again, so slight most would miss it, but it lingered just a fraction longer than before, like something she could not quite place. The meeting began the way they always do, procedural, structured, another board member reading through the agenda in a steady voice, each item announced with the same tone, the same rhythm, as if everything on the list carried equal weight, and I sat there, listening, hands resting loosely in front of me, feeling the quiet build of anticipation in the room as it moved closer to the part everyone was really there for. Next item. The voice at the front continued, flipping a page, compliance enforcement and removal proceedings. And there it was, laid out in plain terms, formal, controlled, but carrying the same intention Linda had delivered at my door that morning. A slight shift moved through the room, chairs adjusting, people leaning forward just enough to signal attention, and Linda straightened slightly, her hand resting on the folder in front of her, ready. Case reference, the board. Member said, reading from the document, property located on, and as my address was spoken out loud, clear and unmistakable, I could feel every head in the room turn, the quiet focus tightening into something more direct, more personal. Linda stood then, smooth and composed, and began to speak, her voice carrying easily through the room, laying out the violations, the notices, the failure to comply, each point delivered with the same certainty she had shown all day, and to anyone listening without context, it sounded complete, consistent, like a story that had already been decided. I let her finish without interruption, the room settling into a brief silence when she sat back down, her hands resting neatly on the table, her expression calm, confident, waiting for the expected next step. I could feel the weight of that expectation pressing forward, the assumption that this would follow the same path it always had, that the process would move from statement to decision without deviation, and for a moment, I let that assumption exist exactly as it was, unchallenged. Then I stood. The chair made a soft sound against the floor as I pushed it back, not loud, but enough to draw attention, and I stepped forward slowly, the room shifting again, attention redirecting, the air changing in a way that was almost tangible. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folder, holding it loosely at my side for a second before placing it on the table in front of me, not opening it yet, just letting it sit there, a quiet contrast to the neat stacks already arranged. Linda's gaze fixed on it immediately, her expression still composed, but tighter now, more focused, like she was trying to identify something that did not fit. I looked around the room once, taking in the faces, the curiosity, the expectation, then back at the board, and finally at Linda. "Before you proceed," I said, my voice even, steady, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without effort. "There is something you need to see." And I rested my hand lightly on the folder, feeling the weight of everything inside it, not in pounds or pages, but in timing, in precision, in the moment it was about to shift everything they thought they understood. The room did not move at first, but I could feel it change, like. The air itself had tightened around that sentence, and for a moment no one spoke, no one shifted. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder, sharper, as if everything was waiting to see whether this was part of the script or something entirely different. Linda's fingers pressed slightly into the edge of her folder, not enough for most people to notice, but I saw it, that small adjustment, the kind people make when something slips just outside their control. "This is not the appropriate time for interruptions," one of the board members said, his voice firm but measured, the kind of tone used to keep things contained, to keep them predictable, and I nodded once, acknowledging him without stepping back. "I agree," I said calmly, resting my hand flat on the folder in front of me, "which is exactly why this needs to be addressed now." A few heads tilted slightly in the audience, curiosity cutting through the earlier certainty, and I could hear a faint rustle as someone shifted in their seat, the quiet kind of movement that signals attention sharpening. I opened the folder slowly, not rushing, letting the sound of paper sliding against paper carry just enough to be noticed, and pulled out the first document, placing it on the table in front of the board where everyone could see it, even if they did not yet understand what they were looking at. "You cited authority under the association," I continued, my voice steady, even. "So let us talk about authority." The words settled differently this time, not as a claim, but as something being examined, and I saw Linda's posture tighten just slightly, her shoulders pulling back as if preparing to respond before she even knew what the response would need to be. One of the board members leaned forward, glancing down at the document, then back up at me. "What is this?" he asked, not dismissive, but cautious now, the first sign that the rhythm of the meeting had been broken. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached back into the folder and placed a second document beside the first, aligning the edges carefully, then a third, each one building on the last, each one adding weight in a way that did not need explanation yet. "These are recorded property agreements," I said finally, letting the words land clearly, filed and active. A murmur moved through the room, low at first, then spreading slightly as people leaned closer, trying to catch details from a distance, and I could feel the attention shifting, no longer centered on the accusations that had been presented, but on the documents now sitting quietly on that table. Linda leaned forward then, just enough to see the top page, and for the first time since she had walked in, her expression did not settle immediately into confidence. It paused. "Those are not relevant to this proceeding," she said quickly, her voice still controlled, but carrying a sharper edge now, like she was trying to redirect something that had already started moving. I turned my head slightly toward her, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence. "They are directly relevant," I replied, calm, precise, and then I looked back at the board. "Because they define who actually holds enforceable interest over multiple properties in this community." That word interest landed harder than authority had earlier, more specific, less abstract, and I saw one of the board members sit up straighter, his attention fully engaged now, no longer procedural. He reached for the top document, lifting it slightly, scanning the lines, his eyes moving more slowly than before, and as he read, the room seemed to quiet again, but this time it was not expectation, it was uncertainty. "This name," he said after a moment, tapping a line on the page. "This is your company?" I nodded once. "It is," I said, keeping my tone even, letting the answer stand without embellishment, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but clear in the way the room shifted again, conversations that had been forming in whispers now stopping completely, attention locking back onto the table. Linda straightened, her hand moving from the edge of her folder to rest flat on the table, her fingers no longer relaxed. "That does not change the violations," she said. But there was a difference now, a slight hesitation between the words, like she was stepping more carefully than before. I reached for another page, sliding it forward, closer to the board member who was already reading. "It changes jurisdiction," I said quietly, and that word settled heavier than anything else so far, precise, unavoidable, and I watched as it registered, not just with him, but with the others at the table. Their expressions shifting from routine to something more analytical, more cautious. The man holding the document looked up again, this time not at me first, but at Linda, and in that brief movement, I saw the balance begin to tilt, not fully, not visibly to everyone yet, but enough to matter. Linda opened her mouth slightly, as if to respond, then stopped, her gaze flicking back to the documents, then to me, and for a second, the certainty that had carried her through the entire day was not gone, but it was no longer absolute. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the folder, feeling the smooth surface under my fingers, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the shift to settle in, for the room to recognize that something had changed even if they could not yet name it. And then I spoke again, my voice steady, controlled, leaving no space for interruption. "Before you decide anything further," I said, "you might want to read the rest." No one spoke right away, but the silence this time was not controlled. It was searching, shifting from certainty into something far less comfortable, and I could see it in the way the board members leaned closer over the documents, their eyes moving slower now, no longer skimming, but reading, actually reading, and every second that passed without Linda interrupting made the room feel heavier, like the weight had quietly moved from one side of the table to the other. The man holding the first page flipped it over, then reached for the next, his brow tightening slightly as he traced a line of text with his finger, and beside him, another board member adjusted her glasses, pulling one of the documents closer, scanning it with a focus that had not been there earlier. I stayed still, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, not pushing, not rushing, just letting the information do what it was designed to do, because documents like these do not need volume, they need time. "These filings are current," the man said after a moment, not to me, but to the room, like he was confirming it out loud for himself, and then he looked up again, this time directly at Linda. Why were we not made aware of this? The question hung there, not loud, but sharp, and for the first time, the direction of authority in the room did not point toward her. Linda straightened again, but this time the movement felt more deliberate, like she was correcting her posture rather than standing naturally. "Because it does not change the fact that he is in violation of community standards," she replied, her voice steady but carrying a strain that had not been there before, and I noticed she did not look at the documents when she said it. She looked at the board, like she was trying to pull them back into the version of the meeting she had prepared. I let that sit for a second, then reached forward and slid another page slightly closer to the center of the table, aligning it with the others. "Page 3, I said calmly, not raising my voice, just guiding attention exactly where it needed to go, and the man followed immediately, flipping to it, his eyes narrowing as he read, then widening just slightly as something clicked into place. "This indicates controlling interest," he said slowly, almost like he was thinking out loud now, and the room responded to that phrase in a way that was impossible to miss. A ripple of quiet reactions, chairs shifting, someone in the back letting out a soft breath they probably did not realize they had been holding. Linda's hand moved again, this time tapping lightly against her folder, a small, repetitive motion that broke her earlier stillness. "Controlling interest does not override association enforcement," she said. But there was hesitation now, small but real, a gap between the words that had not existed before. I turned slightly toward her, just enough to meet her gaze fully this time. "It does when enforcement exceeds legal scope," I said, the words precise, measured, and I did not need to add anything else, because the documents were already saying it for me. The board member holding the pages looked back down, flipping through them again, faster now, cross-checking, confirming, and then he reached for another document from the stack, comparing two lines side by side. "If this is accurate," he said, his voice quieter but more serious, then the association does not have the authority to issue removal under these conditions. And that word authority landed differently now, no longer a shield, but a question. The room shifted again, more noticeably this time, conversations beginning to stir in low whispers, people leaning toward each other, trying to piece together what they were hearing, and I could feel the narrative Linda had built earlier starting to fracture, not dramatically, but enough that it could not hold its original shape. Linda leaned forward, her voice firmer now, trying to regain ground. "This is being misinterpreted," she said. But even as she spoke, she glanced down at the documents for the first time. Just a quick look, but it was enough, because it showed something had changed, something she could not ignore anymore. I let the silence stretch again after she finished, not stepping in immediately, letting the board sit with it, letting them process without pressure, because the more they reached the conclusion themselves, the stronger it would hold. The man at the center of the table finally set the papers down carefully, aligning them with the rest of the stack, his movements slower, more deliberate than before, and he looked from me to Linda, then back to the documents. "We are going to need to pause this proceeding," he said, his tone no longer procedural, but decisive in a different way, one that came from uncertainty rather than control. A murmur spread through the room again, louder this time, no longer contained, and I could see it in the faces around me, the shift from assumption to realization, from certainty to questions, and I stayed exactly where I was, not reacting, not pushing, just letting the moment settle into place. Linda did not speak right away, her gaze fixed on the documents now, her earlier confidence still present, but no longer complete, like something had been pulled out from under it without warning, and for a brief second, the room felt suspended between what it had been and what it was about to become. I rested my hand lightly on the folder, feeling the edge beneath my fingers, and as the board members began quietly discussing next steps among themselves, I knew this was only the beginning of how far it was going to go. The room did not return to what it had been, not even close, because once doubt enters a space like that, it does not leave quietly, it spreads, slow and steady, and I could see it now in the way people looked at each other instead of at the board, in the way the whispers no longer tried to stay hidden, in the way the structure that had felt so controlled at the start of the meeting now seemed to hesitate with every decision. The board members leaned closer together, their voices low but urgent, papers shifting back and forth between them, and every so often one of them would glance up at me, then at Linda, then back down again, like they were recalibrating something they had assumed was already settled. Linda remained standing, but the stillness in her posture was different now, not composed, not controlled, but held in place, like she was choosing not to move rather than simply standing naturally. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried that same firmness, but it no longer filled the room the way it had before. "We are not concluding anything based on incomplete interpretation," she said, her words precise, carefully chosen, but there was something underneath them now, a slight tightening, a carefulness that had not been there earlier, and it did not go unnoticed. The man at the center of the board looked at her, then back at the documents, and then at me, and when he spoke, his tone had shifted completely from where it had started. "This is not incomplete," he said slowly. "This is material to the enforcement action." And that sentence landed heavier than anything else so far, because it was no longer a question, it was a recognition. A quiet ripple moved through the room again, stronger this time, and I could see it clearly now. The moment when people realize the situation they thought they understood is something else entirely, something they had not been told, and something they could not ignore once they saw it. I remained still, hands resting lightly on the table, not adding anything, not pushing further, because the shift was already happening, and the more it unfolded on its own, the more permanent it would be. One of the board members picked up a pen, tapping it lightly against the table as he looked at the documents again, then at Linda. "Why was this not disclosed before issuing removal?" he asked, and the question was direct now, no longer softened by procedure, no longer framed as part of a routine process. And for the first time since this had started, Linda did not answer immediately. She glanced down at the papers again, then back up, her expression tightening just slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was still controlled, but it carried something new, something closer to defense than authority. "Because it does not change the standards of the community," she said, But even as she said it, it sounded smaller, less certain, like it no longer fit the space it was being spoken into. The man at the center shook his head slightly, not dismissive, but firm. "It changes what we are allowed to enforce," he replied, and that distinction settled into the room with a clarity that no one could ignore. A few people in the audience leaned back in their chairs. Others leaned forward, the balance of attention shifting completely away from Linda now, and I could feel it, not as a dramatic reversal, but as something quieter, more decisive, like a line that had been crossed without anyone noticing until it was too late to step back. The board members exchanged a few more words. Then the man at the center straightened slightly, his decision already forming before he spoke. "Effective immediately, this removal action is suspended pending full legal review," he said, his voice steady. Final in a way that carried weight not from confidence, but from necessity, and the effect was immediate. The room exhaling in a way that was almost audible, tension releasing into something closer to realization. Linda stood still for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the table. Then she looked up, not at me, but at the board, and for a second, it seemed like she might respond, might push back, might try to regain the ground that had shifted beneath her, but she did not, because there was nothing left to stand on that had not already been questioned. I reached forward then, gathering the documents slowly, aligning them the same way I had placed them down, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. And as I closed the folder, I felt the weight of the moment settle fully into place, not as a victory, not as something loud or visible, but as something final in a way that did not need to announce itself. I looked up once more, meeting Linda's gaze briefly, and this time, there was no flicker, no hesitation, just a quiet recognition of what had just happened, and I gave a small nod, not to her, not to the board, but to the moment itself, then turned and walked back toward my seat, the room parting slightly as I moved, not out of respect, not out of fear, but out of something simpler, something clearer. Outside, the evening light had deepened, the shadows longer now, stretching across the pavement in ways that made everything look just a little different than it had a few hours ago. And as I stepped out of the building, the air felt cooler, calmer, like the neighborhood itself had not caught up to what had just shifted inside that room. I paused for a second beside my truck, looking out across the rows of houses, the same neat lines, the same quiet order, but now I saw it differently, not as something controlled, but as something built on layers most people never think to question. And as I opened the door and got in, I knew this was not the end of it, not for them, not for Linda, because once something like this starts to unravel, it does not stop where people expect it to.